Ubuntu, or Vagrant SSH CentOS, or whatever you're naming your VM. And then from there, it's all the same stuff. Set your base box, do some networking, give it some RAM, and when you do Vagrant up with this file, you'll get two. We're setting those to stuff to just tell it to update install Nginx. Playbooks are task definition. Definitions in YAML. So right here, this is a playbook. You write a YAML file, and that's where your tasks are defined. You can also define tasks on the command line. This is called ad hoc commands. This is what one looks like. As you can see, even with just this one command that's got 3 parameters, it's doing things in YAML playbooks is the preferred way of working with Ansible. Don't think that you can just write a bash script with a bunch of ad hoc commands, because that's not what we're doing. That's not called a playbook. That's called what are you doing? So here's some basics with YAML, because it might be kind of confusing if you've never worked with it. It's basically Python's version of JSON, and it's actually a superset of JSON. Fun fact. It's a way of storing data. It's white space sensitive, as you would expect from something that's Python, and it's based on maps, dictionaries, hash maps, key value stores, MongoDB, whatever you want to call it. So you can do comments, you can do keys and values, lists, items in the list can be key values. You got support for a couple different type of data types in here. If you want to learn more about data or YAML, you can go to that link. Otherwise, this image right here is basically everything you ever need to know about YAML for Ansible. If you want this example file, it's right up there. So Playbooks. Playbooks is literally just a list of tasks. I mean, if you see these dashes here, these are lists in YAML. It's literally a list of tasks. You can also have roles, but generally a playbook is a list of tasks. It allows you to, instead of having a bunch of ad hoc commands defined in a script, you can write this playbook and point Ansible at the playbook, and it'll automatically look at all those tasks, figure out what it needs to do, and run them one by one across all of the hosts that you have defined. So this is a playbook that just installs Nginx and copies over a simple one-page website. So that's great, right? I mean, we've got a playbook now. We can use it. Let's tell Ansible to use this and spin up a website, right? Not quite. First, we need to give Ansible an inventory. Inventories are how Ansible knows where to run hosts. Usually they're in INI format. You can also write inventories in YAML, but we're not going to do that. That's different. So we're just not going to get there. Inventories are basically lists of all of the hosts by IP address or host name. You can also do aliases to make it more friendly. So like, for example, right here we have a host called blog. It's not actually a host name that I have set up in DNS. It's just an alias. And I tell Ansible where to go by setting the Ansible host variable. And this is the IP address of that thing. You can also group hosts in these groups like this. So if I have two bind servers and I want to execute a task on both of them at the same time, I can put them in the bind group and run that task on the bind group. You can also have little mini kind of regex matching type of things. So if for some reason I have 20 power DNS servers, instead of writing out 20 different entries, I can just do this and it'll match all power DNS 1 to 20. I don't know why you do that, but you can. You can also have groups of groups, and you can set variables in Ansible or in inventory files. So variables are variables. You can apply them to groups or hosts. You can also do dynamic inventories, which is nice. If you're managing, if you can imagine, thousands of servers across a big company's infrastructure, having all of that in an INI file might get a little unwieldy. So dynamic inventories is this concept that Ansible has. Basically, it's just an executable, and you pass that to Ansible to say, this is my inventory. Ansible will run the executable, and then it's expecting some sort of JSON back. And Ansible will parse that JSON, and it'll figure out, OK, these are all the hosts, these are all the groups, these are all the variables that are defined. This lets you pull your inventory definition from somewhere else. So if I have like a documentation app somewhere, or if I just want to pull it straight down from AWS, you don't have to write it all down in this big INI file, or YAML if you want. Got a couple questions. Someone asked, are Ansible scripts guaranteed to be idempotent, or can they be misconfigured to not have that feature? So yes, they can be misconfigured to not be idempotent. A lot of the modules, like for example, we go back, this apt module in the center here, this is idempotent. It's not going to try to reinstall Nginx if Nginx is already there. If Nginx isn't there, it'll install Nginx. That's idempotent. A lot of the really simple modules, they're usually idempotent. If you're copying over a file, it's going to copy over the file if the files aren't matching exactly. But obviously, you can't do everything under the sun with the default modules. Like if I wanted to install GitLab, there isn't, unfortunately, a module that's called GitLab and I say state present, and then it just does the install for me. It's not that simple. So sometimes you have to work with the modules that you have to put together something that's idempotent, and you have to do some things to get that to work properly. It's not that hard, but Ansible isn't some magic sauce that always makes things always idempotent all the time. Usually it's not that bad, but sometimes it can be a pain in the ass. Someone asked, is Ansible compatible with Kata containers? Maybe. I don't know what Kata containers are, but it could be. So we'll get back to where are we? All right, inventories. So when using Ansible with Vagrant, you can use the provisioner thing, the provisioner block for Ansible, and you just point it at a playbook, and Vagrant will run that playbook when you're setting up. But the whole point of this is to try to have a standardized testing environment, and you want that testing environment to be as close to what your production environment will be. And nobody's going to be running Vagrant in their production environment, and if they are, something's wrong. So using the provisioner, that's not that great. You can do it, but we're not going to do it. Instead, we're going to set up Ansible to work with what Vagrant has set up. And basically, under the hood, what's going on with Vagrant when you're doing that Vagrant SSH command is it's using a private key that it has inserted into the box during startup. When it spins up the VM, the first thing that it does is it SSHs in with a known private public key pair that's published. And then it generates a new one, logs in with the publicly known one, and replaces it. So you're not using a public key or a private key that everybody already knows about. And if you do the Vagrant SSH config command, it prints out this config file that's actually a valid SSH configuration. And at the bottom is the slide thing's covering it up. But at the bottom of the thing, it tells you where the private key is that it's using. And you can take that path and plug that in to your variable definitions and tell Ansible, hey, here's the private key that you should use when you're logging in. You can also tell it, like we said before, the host name or the IP address to use and the user to use when you're SSHing in. You can also split out your variables. And like I said before, you can define variables in inventory files, but Ansible actually says in the documentation, don't do this, because if you have a lot of hosts and a lot of groups, things can quickly get really unwieldy with all of those variables. So instead, you should split them out into these group vars and host vars folder. What Ansible will do is, say, for example, in host vars, you've got a host and like your host name blog. It'll look in host vars for any files that match that blog name or files that are blog.yml, .yaml, .cfg. And it'll load all of the variables at runtime that are defined in that file. You can also do the same thing for groups, works the exact same way. If you've got a ton of variables for something, like a group or a host, you can make that file, you can actually make it a folder that's the group or host name. And then inside that folder, just put a bunch of YAML files. You can name them whatever you want, and Ansible will load everything at runtime from all of those files in that directory. This is also really helpful. I'm not going to get into it, but Ansible Vault is a thing that lets you encrypt variables, your variable files. So they're always stored encrypted on the disk. And then at runtime, it will ask you for a vault password. You type in the password, it decrypts the vault, and it loads all those values into memory. And then when it's done, all that just goes away. This is nice so you can commit your playbooks to source control, like a public repository, and theoretically not have to worry about people getting your pseudo passwords and your database passwords and things like that. So once we have all of this set up, we can finally run our playbook on our machine that's running. You do this with the Ansible playbook command, tac I, and tell it the inventory file to look at. And then the last argument is the playbook to run. So this is running that simple playbook that we saw a while back. This one, installing Nginx and copying a web page. So this is what the output looks like. It tells you the task name, and it tells you the output. Green means you're good, it didn't change anything. Yellow means it did change something. It usually will tell you what host changed, or sometimes it'll tell you what it changed. If you see red, that means the task failed for some reason, and you usually see some really nasty JSON output that's a pain in the butt to read. But then you get a little summary here at the bottom of all the different tasks. So we can see that it installed Nginx and copied over that page. And if we go to host port 8080, if you remember we defined that as a port forwarding thing, then we see our cute little web page here. Now if we run it again, theoretically if it's idempotent, it shouldn't do anything, and that's exactly what we see here. We run the playbook one more time just to make sure it's idempotent, and all the tasks return OK. That means they didn't change anything on the host. Sometimes they'll actually do something, like for example this install Nginx step. If you look at the playbook, I said update cache yes. And this is just doing a sudo apt-get update. It's updating the repository cache. So that'll do something every time you run the playbook, but it's not actually changing anything on the host. So it reports that it didn't change anything. What's up?
Did you make it so when I ran the playbook, it did it in Calce, or is that just a thing it does sometimes?
I didn't do that, no.
Have you seen that before?
I haven't.
Are you sure you didn't do it yourself?
I'm
This
positive.
seems like something you
I'm
would do.
positive I didn't.
Yeah, that sounds like a you
It
problem.
seems like something I would do.
Did somebody just make a random push command? Or a random command?
So
Okay,
I
I'll figure that out.
mean, that is a thing. You can have your output in Calce if you want that. That's what gets you going, spices up your life, but that's not default. You're using ZSH?
Yeah.
Maybe there's something weird with, I don't know. It's probably in
I don't have
ZSH.
anything for my.
I blame Scott. That's all.
It's definitely not.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I can run the playbook right now and show
Can you
you.
install Calce and then run it?
No.
Because it might check for Calce.
We'll look at that later. But yeah,
that's a
so
later issue.
so I run it again, and we still have the same website. It's the same exact screenshot. I didn't take another screenshot, but trust me, you just get the same exact result. And then, well, if you did break your website, like let's say somebody defaced my website by replacing the index page, well, then I just run it again. And it was like, oh, hey, I got your back. I changed that index page for you. You're good to go. And now, once again, same exact screenshot, but I promise you, it did work.
Where does it get the website pages that included in the playbook to say, go here? Because I saw the 2 lines that said to copy
Yeah.
the HTML file from a certain directory to the www.
Yep.
Where does it actually get that HTML file from?
Yeah, so good question. This is actually an out-of-date screenshot. If you look at this file, it's not the file module, it's the copy module. But the copy module looks at the SRC parameter and loads that. If it's in a role, it's a bit different, and I'll go over that. But in this case, it's just looking in the local directory for index.html. So if you look in the same directory, there should be an index.html file that copies over.
That's included with the Vagrant VM download.
This is included with the repository. This is in the same location as the tasks.yml file.
When you downloaded the Vagrant VM, that index.html was in the local.
It was in the repository local directory. So like this tasks file is in the same folder as that in the repository that you download from GitHub.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question. So, it's idempotent, fixes our mess ups, but playbooks, that single playbook file that we had, that's nice for small things, but once you get into really anything more advanced, you want to start using roles. And this is where this big structure comes into play. Just like how you split up the variables with the group vars and host vars folder, you can do that with roles. They're meant to be reusable playbooks that have a specific focus, like installing a domain controller or spinning up a DNS server, configuring, if you have some site-wide standards, like you want everybody to have this specific bash RC. That's what roles are meant for. You can use this command that comes with Ansible, Ansible Galaxy init, and specify a role name, and it'll set up this skeleton, this skeleton role for you. I did this in the roles directory. And Ansible Galaxy, quick side note, it's like a Docker Hub or Vagrant Cloud for Ansible roles. Basically, people who write Ansible roles that are really good, they push them up to Ansible Galaxy. And then later on, you can actually reference those roles in your Ansible playbooks. So like if you want to say, hey, this guy has a really cool Nginx playbook that I want to run, you can say in your playbook, run dude.nginx, and it'll pull down dude's Nginx role and run it without you having to download it and set it up in your repository. So that's kind of cool. We're going to go through all these different folders. Defaults, these are like default variables that are set for the role. They're the lowest priority, so literally anything else in the whole like role variable priority stack will override these variables. Files, this is like your index.html. These are files that get copied over verbatim to the configured hosts. Handlers, we'll talk about these a bit more later. These are special tasks that get run conditionally when another task changes something on the host. But we'll talk about that in a bit. Meta, this is metadata about the role, the author, the description, other roles that it depends on. So you can set in the metadata if you want. Like if I have a WordPress role, WordPress depends on a web server, a database, and PHP. So if you write your WordPress role that just downloads WordPress, unpacks it, and runs the 5-minute setup, you can put in the metadata, you can say, hey, I depend on this Nginx role, this PHP role, this MySQL role, and when you run it, Ansible will look at those dependencies, and it'll say, okay, before I can run this role on this host, I have to run these other roles, and it'll do that for you automatically. So you don't have to keep track in your playbooks, all right, which roles do I have to run first? Just define it in the dependencies, and Ansible will take care of it for you. Yeah, excuse me. Tasks, this is the bread and butter. This is where your playbooks go. When you call a role from a playbook outside the role structure, what Ansible will do is run the playbook in the tasks directory called main.yml. You can split out your tasks into multiple different playbooks in that directory. You just have to include them with something like import_playbook. More information about that is in the documentation, but that basically just takes one playbook file and drops it into another to create one big playbook at runtime. Templates, we'll talk about templates a bit more. These are like files, except instead of copying it over verbatim, Ansible will do some fancy templating with Jinja 2 to customize the template per host, and we'll talk about that later. Tests, just a basic playbook and inventory file that you can use to test the inventory or test the Ansible role. And vars, this is exactly like defaults, except it's a slightly higher priority. I don't know why you would use both vars and defaults. I guess there's some use cases, but that's beyond me. And then it also generates a little simple README file template for you to use. So we'll get into a couple more advanced, beyond the bare basics stuff with Ansible tasks, loops. it's pretty common to have to do the same thing multiple times over. Like you got to install the package. A lot of times you got to install 10, 20 packages for something. Instead of writing a bunch of tasks to install one package and then install another package, you can just write one task that installs dependencies and then pass it a loop or a list of packages that it'll loop over and run. So this install the Python setup tools, all these packages with only one task, which is pretty nice. And also, if you have to like copy over a bunch of files, you can do the same thing right here. Pass it a loop paths to files. And this is kind of the beginning of Jinja templating right here, these double curly brackets. Which we'll talk about that in a bit more. Handlers. Handlers are special tasks that do something only when a task returns the changed status. Tasks either return OK, which means they didn't do anything, they didn't change anything on the host. They return changed, which means they succeeded, but they changed something. Failed, which means they just something screwed up when they were running. And then skipped, which I think is the 4 things that they usually return. And skipped means that Ansible just straight up didn't run the task for whatever reason. You can define that sometimes and say like, okay, if this thing did this, then run this task. Or like if the host's distribution is Ubuntu, run these apt commands. Or if the host's distribution is CentOS, then run these yum commands. It'll just skip over the commands that it doesn't need to run. But when a task returns changed, you can run handlers. And these are special tasks that you define in this handlers folder for a role. They get notified at one point, like if this command, for example, you're removing a test database and then you want to reload the privilege tables when that database gets removed. It's part of the MySQL secure installation type thing. Now, if this task here, this module, changes something on the host, then it'll notify the reload privilege tables handler. And that handler will know, okay, I need to run. And Ansible will make sure that that handler gets run at a later point. Usually this is at the end of a playbook or at the end of a role, but it's not immediately after. The next thing that Ansible is going to do after this task is not reload the privilege tables. It's important. If you're depending on that to happen, you can use the flush handlers thing. It's just a task that's like meta : flush handlers. And it makes sure that all tasks, or all handlers, excuse me, that have been notified up to that point run at that point. Yeah, what's up?
Is notify reload privilege tables? Is reload privilege tables like an action phrase, like is it reloaded, or is that a handle for some function you put at other places? Or is that just like?
Yeah, this is a name of a task that's defined in handlers main.yml. You know, like this, you can set the name.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
So it's just that string right there. Make it nice and friendly. Good question. So that's handlers. And then we got templates. Ansible, like many other Python projects, like Flask, uses the Jinja 2 templating engine. This allows you to drop variables into config files at runtime, which sounds super boring, but is really great for, especially for these generalized roles, when you want to have one role, like just installing Nginx, that you can use across everything. So maybe you have a load balancer one place that you're using Nginx for. You could use that role there. Maybe you have a web server another place. You got to use it there. Maybe you're proxying, you know, a UWSGI application. You could theoretically, if you did your templating and setup right, use that same role there too. These variables are the ones that are defined in those variable files and the host vars and group vars and stuff that Ansible collects at runtime. Generally, if you're just dropping in a variable, it's double curly braces and then the variable name, and it'll just insert the value of that variable in at that spot. So this is a WordPress configuration. Anybody who's ever set up WordPress before, there's a bunch of really long-ass salts that you have to generate, salts and keys. So instead of putting these in the configuration file, you can define host variables and set those strings on a per host basis, and then you just have one WordPress configuration that you drop those into, which can be pretty nice. You can also do for loops and conditionals and all that fun stuff with templating. I'm not going to get into that, but if you want to learn more, this link is more information about what you can do with Jinja. Theoretically, you could generate an entire like Nginx server block or Apache configuration file from scratch, just based off of a bunch of different Booleans and string variables and things that you set. It's pretty wild. This is like copying, but when you copy a template, you use the template module for the task. And last thing I want to talk about for YAML, or excuse me, Ansible, is these YAML callbacks. If anybody's ever run Ansible before and it's failed on you, you get a ton of nasty red output that's all just raw JSON with like /n's and /r's and tabs and stuff, and it's really unreadable. Ansible has this callback thing that allows you to customize the output of your playbook runs. You set it in the ansible.cfg file locally, or you can set it in a global, like in your home directory. There's a couple different options, but usually I just set it in the root directory of the project that I'm running in. And this is all that I have set in the Ansible config for this Hacknights repository. And instead of printing it out in nasty JSON, it prints it out in YAML, which is nice because it's way more readable. And also bin Ansible callbacks, true. This will print out, if you're running a command, it'll print out the standard in, or excuse me, it'll print out the standard out and the standard error, just like if you had run it on a terminal. Whereas by default, it just gets, all the new lines are just recorded as /n's, and it's all just line after line, and it's impossible to read. So these are a few quality of life changes I would highly recommend that you make when working on Ansible projects. Just make your life so much easier. I learned about this just last night. So we're going to do a demo of, I'm going to show you guys building that Vagrant file and Ansible, a couple of Ansible roles in Playbook that I had set up in that repository. Just as an example, here it is. So, we gotta pump this up.